There were two bodies on the living room floor, the mother and her husband. Blood covered the carpet and walls, as if the room itself had witnessed a massacre. Their daughter, the dead boy's half-sister, stood nearby. She wasn't crying, she was just looking at the knife in her hands, as if she couldn't believe she had done herself. Robert and Linda's family seemed ordinary at first glance. He was a middle-aged man, worked as a mechanic in a local workshop, always came home tired but calm. Linda took care of the house and worked part-time in a small drugstore. She had a daughter from her first marriage, Melissa. When Linda met Robert, she brought the girl into her new marriage, and they lived together ever since. Robert also had a child, a son, James, about the same age as Melissa. At first, the family reunification seemed like a new page in life. Everyone lived in a small house in the Texas suburbs. In the evenings, they gathered for dinner, talked about school, work, and neighbors. However, behind the external calm, the first cracks began to appear. Melissa had felt a painful attachment to her mother since childhood. When James appeared nearby, to whom Linda paid attention as if he were her own, the girl became jealous. In her eyes, her brother occupied a place that rightfully belonged only to her. Any gesture of her mother's care towards James irritated her. Over the years, these feelings grew stronger. James became more open and sociable. He was loved by his neighbors, he helped in the yard, he often talked to his father. Linda was proud of him, praised him for his good grades, and Melissa perceived this as a betrayal. Her own successes remained in the shadows. Family friends noticed that Melissa was gradually becoming distant. At school events, she stood apart and did not want to be photographed with her family. At the same time, her behavior showed sharpness. She answered any question with irritation and could flare up even over a trifle. The situation was further aggravated by the fact that Robert was strict with her. He saw her temper and demanded discipline. James, on the other hand, found it easy to get along with his father. This further increased the tension. In conversations with her friends, Melissa sometimes said outright that she hated her stepbrother. She blamed him for the fact that their mother had become cold and the house was alien. Her words did not sound like teenage complaints, but like open anger. At first, her friends did not attach any importance to this, but later they recalled that her voice was filled with hatred. In the evenings, quarrels flared up more and more often in the house. Sometimes because of cleaning, sometimes because James took things without asking, sometimes because of an unfortunate look. Melissa reacted violently. She screamed, slammed doors, could leave the house, and return late at night. Linda tried to settle the conflicts, but each time it ended with new accusations. For Melissa, the most painful topic was her mother's attention. She said that Linda loved James more, that her own feelings were of no use to anyone. At such moments, her emotions overwhelmed her so much that her face turned red, her hands shook, and tears turned into rage. A mixture of resentment and jealousy accumulated inside her, which turned into hatred. Sometimes she could sit in a room for hours, not talking to anyone, just listening to music at full volume. Her mother tried to get through to her, but any conversation ended in a scandal. James, unlike her, tried to smooth things over. He said, "She's just jealous, it takes time." But over the years, it became clear there wouldn't be enough time. Their relationship only worsened. Neighbors recalled that screams were often heard in the house, especially on weekends when everyone was home. They often saw Melissa running out into the yard in tears, and her mother following her, trying to calm her down. But instead of reconciliation, everything ended with more accusations. For Melissa herself, every attention to James was a blow. When her mother cooked his favorite dish, when she praised him for helping his father, when she smiled at him, these simple gestures felt like betrayal. She could not accept that her mother was now dividing her love between them. By her mid-teens, the tension had turned into open hatred. She stopped hiding her emotions and could tell her brother outright that she wished him harm. There was no joke in her words. They were real threats, uttered in a fit of anger. By the middle of high school, school had become the place where Melissa felt at least a little free. But even there, her anger and irritation did not go away. Teachers noticed changes in her behavior. If she used to participate in classes, now she sat at the back of the class, not engaging in conversations. She answered questions sharply, sometimes defiantly. Conflicts with classmates appeared in her diaries. Melissa was particularly sensitive to mentions of family. When someone she knew said that James was a nice guy, or that they had a happy family, her face hardened. Everything inside her turned upside down, and it became increasingly difficult to control herself. Friends said that she would suddenly burst into a long speech about how she hated her brother and how he ruined everything. At such moments, her eyes would fill with tears, her voice would break, and her hands would shake. Emotions were spilling out of home, too. The arguments were getting louder and longer. James was increasingly leaving the house to visit friends, just to avoid Melissa. But this irritated her, too. She accused him of deliberately avoiding her, making her feel guilty. Linda tried to get them to sit down at the same table and talk, but the conversations turned into angry outbursts. One evening, the argument reached its climax. James came home later than usual, and his mother asked him, smiling, where he had been. He told her he had been helping a neighbor fix his car. Linda praised him for being responsible. At that moment, Melissa, who was sitting next to him, threw her fork down on the table and shouted that he should stop pretending he was better. Her voice was breaking, and her eyes were filled with tears, but they were not tears of hurt. They were tears of anger. Linda tried to stop her, but Melissa was no longer listening. She jumped up and ran to her room, slamming the door so hard that the windows in the house rattled. Such scenes were repeated more and more often. Neighbors noted that in the evenings, screams, slamming doors, and even the sounds of broken dishes could be heard from the house. People exchanged glances, but no one dared to interfere. In a small town, people were used to the fact that family conflicts remained behind closed doors. Melissa kept personal notes. Her notebook, which was later seized by investigators, contained lines full of despair and anger. She wrote that her mother betrayed her, that her brother took everything. Sometimes the lines were fragmentary, as if she was writing under great emotional stress. There were also phrases like, "I want him gone, Mom chose him over me." The psychological stress was reflected in her appearance. The girl lost weight, began wearing dark clothes, and avoided socializing. At school, she was almost never seen with a smile. Teachers noticed that she became withdrawn, but aggressive in response to any remark. At the same time, James, on the contrary, remained friendly and open. He did not understand the depth of his sister's hatred and perceived her outbursts as teenage whims. But it was precisely this misunderstanding that further fueled the fire in Melissa's soul. It seemed to her that he was deliberately demonstrating calm in order to make her look bad. With each passing month, the emotions in the house grew more intense. The slightest situation could lead to conflict. If James sat down at the computer, Melissa would claim that he was taking her place. If his mother bought him a new shirt, she would accuse her of forgetting about her. Even when Linda tried to share the attention, the result was the opposite. Melissa felt even more deprived. Sometimes there would be a cold determination in her eyes. At such moments, she would sit silently, unresponsive to anything, clenching her fists so hard that her fingers would turn white. It seemed as if an unexpressed energy was building up inside her, ready to burst forth. One day, Linda noticed a knife in the kitchen that her daughter had left on the table. The knife was stuck point down into the cutting board. There was no one around. Linda anxiously asked why she had done that. Melissa answered coldly, "I was just checking how sharp it was." And she left without looking back. These small episodes formed a disturbing picture. But the family had become accustomed to the tension and no longer perceived it as a threat. It had become routine for them. No one thought that behind the outbursts of emotion, there was a growing readiness for a radical step. Inside Melissa, the battle between hurt and rage became a constant state. She lived with the feeling that every morning she woke up in a house where she was hated and rejected. This emotional intensity, which had been building for years, finally found an outlet and led to a tragedy that shook the entire town. The day of the murder began as usual. Linda went to work at the pharmacy in the morning. Robert went to the workshop. James stayed at home. He had a day off. Melissa woke up later, sat in her room for a long time, not even going out for breakfast. She looked tense. Neighbors recalled seeing her at the window. She sat motionless, as if she was thinking hard about something. By evening, the whole family had gathered at home. Linda cooked meat for dinner and, as always, praised James for helping with the housework. This praise was the last straw. Melissa abruptly threw down the cutlery, got up from the table, and started screaming. There was rage in her words. She accused her mother of loving only her new son and having forgotten about her long ago. Robert tried to intervene, to calm her down, but this only increased the tension. James said something conciliatory, but in response he heard a stream of accusations. Melissa was completely overwhelmed by emotion. Her face was red, her lips were trembling, her hands were clenched into fists. She ran into the kitchen, grabbed a large kitchen knife. At that moment, there was no longer any doubt in her eyes, only determination. Returning to the living room, she approached James. He rose from the couch, trying to say something, but Melissa hit him right in the chest. A scream tore through the silence. Linda jumped up, rushed to the children, but ran into her daughter's cold gaze. At that moment, it seemed that Melissa stopped seeing the people in front of her, only the enemies who had deprived her of her place next to her mother. Her breathing became rapid, her movements abrupt. With a second blow, she wounded her brother in the stomach. James fell, clutching his wound. Blood splattered the floor. Linda screamed, begging her to stop, but Melissa turned and stabbed her mother. There was a mixture of despair and anger in her eyes, as if all the years of resentment had been released in 1 second. Robert, hearing the noise, ran out of the kitchen and tried to snatch the knife away, but Melissa, in her rage, stabbed him too. Blood splattered the walls. The sounds of the struggle mixed with the screams. Neighbors later reported hearing screams and banging. Someone called the police, but it all happened too fast. When it was all over, the room was deathly silent. Linda and Robert were lying on the floor, James bleeding next to them. Melissa stood over them, clutching a knife, breathing heavily. Her hands were shaking. Her face was covered in tears, but not from regret, from the tension that had just burst. She didn't try to hide. She sat on the floor, pressing the blade to her chest, as if she wanted to make sure that it really happened. There was emptiness in her eyes. When the police burst into the house, she didn't resist. She just said, "Now she's mine." It became clear to investigators that this was not a sudden decision. The intensity of emotions had been building for years, and that evening it burst forth. But the tragedy was so swift that none of her loved ones even had time to realize how dangerous her condition had become. The first police officers arrived on the scene within minutes of the neighbors calling. When they entered the house, the scene they saw was later described as one of the most macabre they had ever seen. 3 bodies lay on the living room floor. 2 adults were no longer showing signs of life. James was still breathing, his eyes full of horror and pain. He was trying to move his hand, but his strength was leaving him. Blood was soaking the carpet, and each breath the boy took was accompanied by a wheezing sound. Melissa sat in the middle of the room, next to the couch. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trying to escape. She wasn't asking for help. Her hands were covered in blood. The knife was still lying next to her. There was a strange expression on her face, a mixture of fatigue and satisfaction. As the officers approached, she looked straight at them and allowed them to handcuff her without resistance. The police immediately called an ambulance, but the doctors who arrived at the scene were unable to save James. He was pronounced dead that same evening. The atmosphere in the house was extremely tense. Officers noted the smell of blood, the screams of neighbors from the street, the flickering light of sirens. All this creates the feeling that time has stopped. The emotions of those present reached their breaking point. One of the investigators later admitted that it was difficult for him to remain calm. Seeing a young man killed by his sister and a mother killed by her daughter is a burden that not everyone can bear. But the work required precision. The house was cordoned off, and evidence began to be collected. Melissa's every move was followed by intense scrutiny. She did not act like a person in shock. Her breathing was even, her gaze calm. She answered questions briefly. Yes, no. When asked why she did it, she said quietly, "Because they took her from me." There was no scream in these words, but a composure that sent a chill down the officers' spines. The interrogation at the station showed that the emotional tension was still boiling inside her. She did not cry, but in moments of silence her hands shook. Sometimes she would suddenly change her intonation. First she would speak calmly, then suddenly she would break down, raising her voice. The investigators recorded every detail. Her words were full of accusations against James, sometimes even against her mother, but nowhere was there any regret. Neighbors interviewed that evening described the atmosphere in the home in recent months as explosive. Many heard constant shouting, arguments, and saw Melissa run out into the street in tears. But no one could have predicted that the tension would reach such a tragic conclusion. One neighbor put it bluntly, "We thought it was just family problems." No one believed she was capable of something like this. During the investigation, the police seized her diaries. They found entries that proved premeditation. The pages were covered in harsh phrases that showed hatred and despair. Some lines were full of anger. "I want him to disappear," she chose him. Others were desperate and painful. "My mother doesn't love me. I'm superfluous." Investigators who studied the entries noted that each page seemed to be saturated with emotions that could not be contained. As the investigation progressed, public outcry grew in the town. Local newspapers wrote about the family tragedy, and television showed footage of the cordoned-off house. People came to the house with flowers, and many cried. The atmosphere in the town was filled with shock and fear. A murder committed by a daughter against her own family seemed impossible. For the police and prosecutors, this case was particularly difficult. Every time they returned to the details of the crime, emotions washed over them again. But they understood that they had to carefully and calmly collect evidence so that the court could deliver a fair verdict. The emotional intensity was also felt in the courtroom during the preliminary hearings. Melissa was brought in handcuffs. She sat silently, barely raising her head. Robert's relatives and several family friends were in the courtroom. Their tears and cries of despair accompanied each hearing. The atmosphere resembled heavy anticipation. Everyone understood that a long trial lay ahead, and the fate of the girl who had committed a brutal crime depended on it. Thus, the investigation, interrogations, and the first steps of the trial revealed not only the facts of the crime, but also the depth of the emotional tension around it. This tension was felt in every word, in every look, in every detail related to the case. The family tragedy ceased to be just personal. It became a test for the entire community. Melissa's trial began a few months after the tragedy. Already at the first session, the courtroom was packed. Journalists occupied the front rows. Robert's relatives and family friends sat silently. Many held photographs of the dead. The atmosphere was heavy and tense, as if everyone present understood that there would be more than just facts here. Emotions, experiences, and pain would come alive here. When Melissa was brought in, the courtroom was deathly silent. She walked slowly, handcuffed, with her head down. Her face remained almost emotionless, but her gaze, fixed on the floor, betrayed her inner tension. Some relatives could not contain their emotions. Shouts were heard. "Murder! How could you?" The judge was forced to call to order. The prosecutor began by describing the crime. His speech was dry, but that made it even harsher. He listed the blows, talked about the nature of the wounds, showed photographs from the crime scene. People in the courtroom covered their faces with their hands. Some could not hold back their tears. Every word, every photo seemed to reopen the wound. The emotional intensity reached the boiling point. Relatives were breathing heavily. Some had shaking hands. Journalists recorded every detail. As witnesses spoke, the emotions grew even more intense. Neighbors described hearing screams from the house and seeing Melissa often running out into the street in hysterics. One of them admitted that he still can't sleep peacefully remembering that evening. His voice was shaking and his eyes were filled with horror. The testimony of Melissa's close friend made a special impression. She told of conversations in which Melissa confessed her hatred for her brother, saying that Mom chose him. The girl could barely speak. Her voice broke, tears rolled down her cheeks. There was a tense silence in the room. Everyone listened to her words. The lawyer tried to build a defense on Melissa's mental state. He claimed that she was in a state of severe emotional breakdown, that her actions could not be considered cold-blooded murder. He referred to diary entries, where there was a lot of despair and pain. However, the prosecutor insisted that the entries only confirmed that the hatred had been accumulating for a long time and purposefully. Each hearing was an emotional ordeal. When the results of the examinations were read out, the room was reminded once again of how brutal the crime had been. The descriptions of the injuries sounded dry and medical, but behind these words lay the real suffering of the victims. Relatives repeatedly asked to interrupt the hearing to catch their breath. Melissa, on the other hand, remained outwardly calm the entire time. She did not try to justify herself, did not ask for forgiveness. Sometimes her hands shook, sometimes she pressed her lips so hard that her face turned pale, but no one heard words of regret. This only increased the emotional intensity in the room. Many saw in her silence not weakness, but coldness. The final session was the culmination. The judge listened to the closing statement. The prosecutor spoke about the cruelty of the crime, about how Melissa deliberately took the lives of 3 people, including her own brother. The lawyer repeated, she was in a state of affect and asked to take into account her age and psychological state. When the judge retired to the deliberation room, the courtroom was filled with tension. The minutes of waiting seemed like an eternity. People were whispering, crying, some were holding crosses, some were closing their eyes. The verdict was clear, guilty of aggravated murder. The sentence was life imprisonment. The courtroom erupted in cries. Some cried from relief, others from despair. Relatives hugged each other. Journalists rushed to report the news. Melissa listened to the verdict without any visible emotion. She just nodded as if she had expected it. But as she was led out of the courtroom, her lips were seen to tremble slightly. Whether it was fear or the last remnants of suppressed rage, no one could say. The emotional intensity of the trial left its mark on everyone in the room. This was more than just a trial. It was a clash of pain, loss, and irreparable tragedy that tore apart not only a family, but an entire community. A family tragedy ended with Melissa getting a life sentence. 3 lives were cut short in one evening, and dozens more were maimed. The trial closed the case officially, but the memory of what happened remains a painful reminder for the entire town.